A single mother in Maryland, named Jean, told the Washington Post that she shoplifted cans of baby formula by driving to a Walmart one state over because she could not produce enough breast milk for her infant son. She stopped when the store began locking up the formula behind plexiglass cases. And then the pandemic hit. And finding a job and childcare became impossible simultaneously. And when money got tight, she prioritized rent and her car payment over groceries, because losing the apartment or the car meant losing everything. She did not stop eating because she wanted to. She stopped eating because the math stopped working. Her car and her apartment were things that could be taken from her, and then where would that leave her and her son? That is a direct quote, and Jean is not an outlier. She is a preview. Because right now in the spring of 2026, the United States Department of Agriculture confirms that 47.9 million Americans lived in food-insecure households last year. 1 in 7 American households did not have reliable access to enough food. 14.1 million children lived in homes where there was not always enough to eat. And the Food Research and Action Center called the SNAP cuts enacted in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act the deepest cuts to the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program in the history of the program. $187 billion in SNAP funding eliminated over the next decade. And then the USDA announced it was terminating the Household Food Security Report entirely, the only comprehensive federal survey that tracks who is going hungry in America and why, a report that has been published every year for nearly 30 years. They are not just cutting the food, they are cutting the ability to measure the hunger that the food cuts create. And what I am about to tell you in this video is not about policy, it is not about politics. It is about what happens to human beings, to your neighbors, to the people in line behind you at the pharmacy, to the grandmother in the apartment above yours, when the food runs out. Because Americans have never been tested like this in the modern era, and you do not want to see what starving Americans will do. Not because they are bad people, because hunger makes good people do desperate things. And if you are watching this right now and thinking that this does not apply to you, that you are comfortable, that your pantry is full, that your budget works, I want you to understand something. The USDA documented that food insecurity affected 33.5% of households with reported incomes below 185% of the poverty threshold. That is households earning less than approximately $57,000 for a family of 4. But food insecurity is climbing even in households above that threshold. The USDA data showed that very low food security, the most severe category, increased for households with incomes at or above 185% of the poverty line between 2023 and 2024. That means hunger is moving upward through the income distribution. It is no longer confined to the poorest Americans. It is reaching families with jobs, with cars, with mortgages, who made every responsible decision and are still running out of food before the end of the month because the cost of everything else consumed the grocery budget first. More single-parent households headed by women experienced food insecurity at 36.8%, nearly 2% higher than the year before. Households in urban areas at 16% and rural areas at 15.9% both experienced food insecurity at rates far above suburban households at 11.9%. And households in the southern region had the highest rates of any U.S. region at 15%. These are not small numbers, these are not rounding errors. These are tens of millions of human beings in the richest country in the history of the world who do not know where their next meal is coming from. And the decisions they make under that pressure are decisions that comfortable people cannot imagine making, until they have to. Shoplifting in America has surged 93% since 2019, and 45% of shoplifters are stealing food. Retail theft losses in the United States reached $112 billion in 2023, the highest recorded retail shrink in American history, according to the National Retail Federation. That number climbed further in 2024, with a combined 19% increase in shoplifting and merchandise theft incidents year over year. Shoplifting has increased 93% since 2019, and according to analysis published by HR News, 45% of shoplifters are stealing food, not electronics, not designer clothing, not jewelry. Food. Meat is the most shoplifted item in American grocery stores. The NRF documented that professional theft rings are running organized meat-stealing operations that hit multiple stores in a single day, load up on premium cuts, and resell them to restaurants and suppliers at below-market prices. But those organized rings are not the story I want you to understand. The story I want you to understand is the woman who puts a pack of chicken thighs under her jacket because her SNAP benefits ran out on the 22nd of the month, and there are 8 days until the next deposit. The story is the 70-year-old man who pockets a can of soup because his Social Security check covers rent and his Part B premium and his prescriptions but does not cover 3 meals a day. The story is the father who scans a $14 pack of ribeyes as bananas at the self-checkout because his children have not eaten red meat in 2 months and he cannot look at their faces anymore. Stores catch shoplifters approximately 2% of the time. The average shoplifter is arrested once out of every 100 incidents, which means for every shoplifting arrest you read about in the news, 99 others occurred that nobody counted, nobody reported, and nobody acknowledged as what they actually are, a measure of desperation that is more accurate than any government statistic. Because the Bureau of Labor Statistics can tell you that inflation is 3.3%. But the shoplifting data tells you that 45% of theft in American retail stores is food, and that number tells you something that no inflation report can capture. It tells you that the system has already broken for millions of Americans who can no longer afford to eat within the law, and those millions are growing. The Council on Criminal Justice documented that urban shoplifting rates in 2024 ran 24% higher than the year before. California launched a dedicated crackdown that resulted in 29,060 arrests and $226 million in recovered stolen goods. The FBI released its first flash mob shoplifting report in December 2025, documenting 3,321 incidents. This is not petty crime. This is a symptom. And the disease is hunger. And there is one more dimension to the shoplifting crisis that nobody in mainstream media will discuss because it implicates the system rather than the individual. Grocery stores in low-income neighborhoods are responding to theft by locking products behind glass, installing more surveillance, reducing store hours, and in some cases closing locations entirely. Walgreens closed dozens of stores in San Francisco, citing theft. Dollar General and Dollar Tree closed hundreds of locations in communities where they were the only affordable food option within miles. When a store closes in a food desert, the food desert expands. The community that was already underserved becomes unserved. And the people who live there, who were already food insecure, now have to travel further, spend more on transportation, and pay higher prices at the remaining stores that have raised prices to cover their own theft losses. The theft creates a feedback loop. Hunger drives theft. Theft drives store closures. Store closures deepen the food desert. The deeper food desert intensifies the hunger, and the cycle accelerates with every turn. And the people trapped in that cycle are invisible to the policymakers who cut the programs that were supposed to prevent the hunger that started the cycle in the first place. 50 million Americans walked into a food bank last year, and food banks are running out of food to give them. Feeding America, the largest hunger relief organization in the country, reported that over 50 million Americans turned to food banks and food pantries for help. 50 million. That is more than the entire population of Spain. That is roughly 15% of the American population walking into a building and asking for free food because they could not afford to buy it. And the food banks are breaking. Demand has outstripped supply in communities across the country. Food banks that were built to serve as emergency stopgaps to fill a temporary gap in a family's budget during a crisis are now functioning as permanent grocery stores for millions of Americans who have no other reliable source of nutrition. Feeding America's own research documented that the ripple effects of hunger and poor nutrition are driving up medical spending and emergency care use, especially in communities that were already facing systemic barriers to healthcare access. People who are food insecure are more likely to have diabetes, hypertension, heart disease, anxiety, and depression. For older adults, hunger accelerates physical decline and increases hospitalizations. For children, it hinders brain development, academic performance, and long-term economic opportunity. The CLASP Research Center warned that the hunger is not just about what is on a family's table. It affects their health, their stability, and their futures. And the food bank system was never designed to replace the federal nutrition programs that are being dismantled. Food banks run on donated surplus and volunteer labor. They cannot guarantee consistent access to nutritious food. They do not have the supply chains, the refrigeration, the logistics, or the funding to replace what SNAP provides. When SNAP benefits are cut by $187 billion over the next decade, the demand for food bank services will surge at the exact moment that the food bank's own supplies are under pressure from the same inflationary forces that are driving the hunger in the first place. The food that food banks distribute has to be purchased or donated. When food prices rise 36%, as they have since 2014, the purchasing power of food bank budgets shrinks by the same percentage. They can buy less food with the same dollars, and they are being asked to serve more people with less food. A 2024 qualitative study found that food bank practitioners overwhelmingly understand that food banks and charity will not solve the issue of hunger in America. The people running the food banks know the system is failing. They are telling anyone who will listen that charity cannot replace public policy. And public policy just enacted the largest cuts to food assistance in American history. And the specific mechanics of those cuts are designed in a way that maximizes harm while minimizing political visibility. FRAC documented that the budget reconciliation law eliminated the internet deduction from the SNAP shelter deduction, which sounds technical until you realize that millions of households count their internet bill as part of their shelter costs for SNAP eligibility purposes. Removing that deduction reduces the benefit amount for every household that currently claims it. The law also expanded work requirements to include adults ages 55 to 64 for the first time, targeting the exact demographic that experiences the highest rates of age discrimination and the longest periods of unemployment after job loss. FRAC warned on May 7, 2026, that the USDA's new SNAP stocking rule risks shuttering thousands of small retailers, leaving families without food access in communities where the nearest full-service grocery store is 10 or 20 miles away. Rural food deserts, where SNAP recipients currently use their benefits at small corner stores and gas station markets because no other option exists, will lose even those limited access points if the stocking requirements force small retailers to drop out of the program. And on April 30th, the House passed a farm bill that FRAC described as deeply troubling because it fails to reverse the $187 billion in SNAP cuts enacted under the reconciliation law. The farm bill was supposed to be the legislative vehicle for restoring SNAP funding. Instead, it passed 224 to 200, with the cuts intact. The legislative opportunity to reverse the damage has been used and spent. The cuts are now locked in for the foreseeable future. And the 40 million Americans who depend on SNAP will begin experiencing reduced benefits as the implementation timeline unfolds over the next 2 years. Benefits will be cut by approximately $100 per month for roughly 600,000 households. For a family that is already choosing between food and heat, $100 per month is approximately 22 meals. That is 22 meals per month removed from the budget of a family that was already food insecure, and the SNAP benefits that remain are already insufficient. The Thrifty Food Plan, which determines the benefit level, has been criticized for decades as unrealistic. It assumes cooking from scratch with nutritionally complete ingredients, which requires time, equipment, knowledge, and physical ability that many SNAP recipients, particularly elderly and disabled recipients, do not have. Fertilizer prices surged 46% in 1 month, and most Americans do not understand what that means for the food supply. World Bank commodity market data showed that urea fertilizer prices surged by nearly 46% month over month between February and March 2026, as the Iran war disrupted production and shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. The Carnegie Endowment for International Peace published an analysis with a headline that said everything. Fertilizer isn't getting through the Strait of Hormuz, which could worsen global food prices. CNBC reported on March 25 that fertilizer prices were surging amid the Iran war, sparking food security warnings across the industry. And the World Food Program projected that the conflict could push 45 million additional people into acute hunger by mid-26, pushing global food insecurity to levels last seen at the start of the Ukraine war in 2022, when 349 million people were impacted. The UN Food and Agriculture Organization warned that the risks from the current conflict, including energy price shocks and trade route disruptions, are setting the stage for sharper price increases in the months ahead. And the FAO Food Price Index has risen for 2 consecutive months to its highest level since December 2024. Every bushel of corn, every acre of wheat, every field of soybeans in America depends on fertilizer. Fertilizer is to agriculture what gasoline is to transportation. Without it, yields collapse. With expensive fertilizer, the cost of production rises, and that cost is passed directly to the consumer at the grocery store. The American Farm Bureau Federation reported in February 2026 that farm bankruptcies continued to climb throughout 2025. American farmers are already operating on margins so thin that a 46% fertilizer price increase is not an inconvenience. It is an existential threat to the viability of thousands of farming operations. And when farms fail, the food they produce does not magically appear from somewhere else. It disappears from the supply chain. And the supply chain that feeds 330 million Americans has approximately 72 hours of inventory on grocery store shelves at any given time. That is the margin. 72 hours between a functioning food system and visible scarcity. And fertilizer prices just surged 46% in a single month because the waterway that moves the raw materials for food production was closed by a war that the American public never voted for, and that most Americans cannot explain if you ask them what it is about. And the connection between fertilizer and your dinner table is more direct than most Americans realize. Modern American agriculture is almost entirely dependent on synthetic nitrogen fertilizer derived from natural gas. Without it, corn yields drop by approximately 40%. Wheat yields drop by a comparable percentage. Soybean yields decline. Cotton production falls. The Green Revolution that allowed America to feed itself and export food to the world was built on cheap, abundant fertilizer, and that fertilizer supply chain runs through the Strait of Hormuz, through natural gas markets that are now destabilized by the largest energy supply disruption in history, and through a global commodity market that is hoarding inventory in anticipation of further disruptions. American farmers are making planting decisions right now for the 2026 growing season. Those decisions are being made against a backdrop of fertilizer prices that are 46% higher than they were 2 months ago, diesel prices that have risen substantially due to the war, or commodity prices that do not yet reflect the cost increases because the futures market is still absorbing the shock. If farmers plant fewer acres because input costs are too high, the harvest that arrives in September and October of 2026 will be smaller. And a smaller domestic harvest, combined with disrupted global supply chains, combined with continued inflationary pressure on transportation and processing costs, means grocery prices in the fourth quarter of 2026 and into 2027 will be significantly higher than they are today. The food price increases that Americans have experienced over the past 6 years may have been the beginning, not the end, of the agricultural affordability crisis. And the 47.9 million Americans who are already food insecure will bear the brunt of every percentage point of additional increase because they have already exhausted every coping mechanism available to them. They have already switched to cheaper brands, they have already reduced portion sizes, they have already skipped meals, they have already visited the food bank, there is nothing left to cut. The next increase does not compress their budget further. It eliminates a meal entirely. Washington just eliminated America's ability to even measure how many people are going hungry. In December 2025, after releasing the Household Food Security Report that documented 47.9 million food insecure Americans, the USDA announced that it would be terminating the report entirely. Going forward, the federal government will no longer produce the comprehensive government-backed survey that has been the backbone of hunger measurement in this country for nearly 30 years. CLASP, the Center for Law and Social Policy, published an analysis titled Fading to Invisible that laid out what this means. The report uses data from the Current Population Survey, a joint project between the Census Bureau and the Bureau of Labor Statistics that reaches approximately 60,000 households every month through phone calls and in-person interviews. It is the most reliable, most granular, most scientifically rigorous measure of food insecurity in the United States. And it is being killed at the exact moment that the deepest snap cuts in history are being implemented. That timing is not coincidental. If you are going to cut $187 billion in food assistance, the last thing you want is a federal report published annually that documents the resulting increase in hunger. Eliminating the report does not eliminate the hunger. It eliminates the accountability. It ensures that when a member of Congress stands before their constituents and says the economy is strong, there is no federally produced, scientifically rigorous data set that contradicts them by showing that 50 or 55 or 60 million Americans cannot reliably afford to eat. CLASP warned that without reliable federal data, the disparities become easier to ignore and harder to address. Immigrant families, particularly mixed-status households, risk becoming invisible. Tribal and rural communities, which experience the highest rates of food insecurity but have the least access to local research, will see their experiences minimized or dismissed. Black households experience food insecurity at 24.4%, more than double the rate of white non-Hispanic households at 10.1%. Latinx households at 20.2%. Southern states have the highest regional rates of food insecurity, with Arkansas at 19.4%. And now the instrument that tracks those numbers, that disaggregates them by race, geography, income, and household composition, that allows researchers and advocates to identify where the hunger is concentrated and how it is changing, is being eliminated. You cannot manage what you do not measure. And the decision to stop measuring hunger in America is the decision to stop managing hunger in America. It is not a budget cut. It is an abdication. Hunger does not make people passive, and every civilization that forgot this paid the price. Here is what history teaches about what happens when a significant percentage of a population cannot afford to eat. The French Revolution of 1789 was triggered not by political philosophy alone, but by the price of bread. Bread consumed approximately 88% of the average worker's wages in the months before the storming of the Bastille. The Russian Revolution of 1917 began with bread riots in Petrograd, where women marched to demand food for their families. The Arab Spring of 2011 was ignited in part by food price spikes that pushed staples beyond the reach of ordinary households across North Africa and the Middle East. The 2019 protests that swept Chile, Ecuador, Lebanon, and Iran were all connected to the cost of living and specifically to the cost of food and fuel. In every case, the governments involved believed the situation was manageable. In every case, they were wrong. The United States has not experienced widespread food-related civil unrest since the Great Depression, when hunger marches, food riots, and organized looting occurred in cities across the country. In 1931, hundreds of men and women in Minneapolis raided a grocery store and took food for their families in an event that was covered in newspapers across the nation. In New York, groups of unemployed workers organized to demand food from bakeries and grocers. In Detroit, Ford Motor Company security guards opened fire on a hunger march, killing 5 people. Americans do not learn this history because it contradicts the narrative that American society is fundamentally stable and that the social contract, even when strained, always holds. The social contract holds when people can eat. When they cannot eat, the contract does not hold. It has never held anywhere on Earth under those conditions, and the conditions building in the United States in 2026 are not identical to 1931 or 1789 or 2011, but they share the same structural feature. A growing percentage of the population cannot afford the basic caloric intake required to sustain life, while the institutions responsible for preventing that outcome are simultaneously cutting assistance, raising barriers, and eliminating the data that would reveal the scale of the failure. That combination, hunger plus institutional withdrawal plus information suppression, has preceded social instability in every society where it has occurred. The question is not whether Americans will react to being unable to feed themselves and their children. The question is how. And the answer depends entirely on what happens in the next 12 months. If the SNAP cuts are reversed, if food assistance is expanded to match actual need, if the USDA resumes measuring food insecurity, if the fertilizer supply chain is restored, if the war-driven food inflation is contained, the trajectory can be changed. But if the cuts proceed, if the measurement is eliminated, if the fertilizer shock translates into higher food prices through the fall and winter, if the food banks continue to be overwhelmed, the trajectory leads somewhere that no American wants to go. And the people who will arrive there first are the same people who always arrive first. The elderly on fixed incomes who have already cut their prescriptions to afford groceries. The single mothers who are already skipping meals so their children can eat. The disabled adults who cannot work the 80 hours per month that the new Medicaid requirements demand and who will lose their health care at the same time their food assistance is cut. The working poor who earn too much to qualify for assistance and too little to afford food at current prices. These are not statistics. They are your neighbors. They are the people you see at the grocery store who put items back at the register because the total exceeds what they have. They are the people in the parking lot who sit in their cars after shopping and cry because the bag cost $87 and it used to cost $55, and the difference is the difference between making it to the end of the month and not making it. And when enough of those people, in enough cities, in enough neighborhoods, reach the point where the math no longer works, and the food bank line is 3 hours long, and the SNAP benefits have been cut, and the shelves are locked behind plexiglass, and the formula is $42 a can, and the rent is due in 4 days, something gives. Something always gives. It has given in every society in recorded history where the conditions aligned. And the conditions are aligning right now in the United States of America, the richest country in the history of the world, where 47.9 million people cannot reliably afford to eat, where 50 million walked into a food bank last year, where shoplifting has surged 93% and nearly half of it is food, where the government just enacted the largest cuts to food assistance ever recorded, and where the federal agency responsible for measuring hunger just announced it will stop measuring, where fertilizer prices surged 46% in a single month, where the World Food Program projects 45 million more people pushed into acute hunger globally by mid-2026, and where farm bankruptcies climbed throughout 2025, while the American food supply chain operates with 72 hours of inventory on grocery store shelves. And the one thing that separates the United States from every historical example of food crisis-driven unrest is the social safety net. SNAP, YSP, DUDIAC, school lunch programs, food banks. Those programs are the buffer between discomfort and desperation, between a household that eats less and a household that does not eat, between a father who puts items back at the register and a father who puts them under his jacket, and that buffer is being systematically dismantled at the exact moment the pressure on it is increasing from every direction simultaneously. The Iran war is driving up energy costs that cascade into food production. The fertilizer shock is threatening crop yields. Farm bankruptcies are climbing. The snap cuts are removing $187 billion in food purchasing power. The food security report is being eliminated. The farm bill passed without reversing the cuts. The food banks are overwhelmed. And the next grocery price increase, driven by the March energy shock, is 60 to 90 days from hitting the shelf. When you remove the buffer between a population and hunger, you do not get an orderly decline. You get a threshold event where the number of people who cannot feed their families crosses from manageable to unmanageable. Share this video with every American you know. Not for the algorithm. Because the woman in line behind you at the pharmacy might be Jean, and the man pocketing the soup might be someone's grandfather. And the father scanning the ribeyes as bananas might be doing the only thing he can think of to put protein on his children's plates. And none of them will ever tell you what they are going through, because hunger in America is silent. It hides behind closed doors and drawn curtains and smiles that cost everything to produce. The only way the silence breaks is if enough people see the numbers, understand the trajectory, and refuse to accept that the richest country on earth cannot feed its own people.